You are a poor but very intelligent guy. That's why one day you were sought out to serve as a private tutor to some girls. What they didn't tell you is that these girls are your same age, they study with you, they are quintuplets, and on top of that, they don't respect you. So the first thing you will have to do is earn their respect, or else their father will fire you. I can already tell you that this job won't be easy. The anime begins by introducing our protagonist, a guy named Futaro who is actually quite ordinary. By the standards of his high school, he could be considered poor because most of the students there come from wealthy families. In contrast, the protagonist carefully calculates his expenses to make his meals more affordable. One day, he ends up sharing a table with a redhead who, to be honest, is quite attractive. However, the protagonist isn't interested in girls to the extent of trying to impress them. Instead, he notices that she bought a lot of food, which suggests that she's not from the same social background as him. He decides to ignore her and focus on his studies for upcoming exams. Seeing him studying and eating at the same time, the redhead girl remarks that it's rude to eat while reading. She becomes curious about his academic performance and, since she isn't particularly good at studies herself, she asks him to explain some things to her in exchange for sharing her food. She noticed that he didn't eat much. However, our protagonist isn't great at socializing, so he declines her offer and leaves. Later, Futaro receives a call from his sister who informs him about a wealthy man willing to pay generously for someone to provide private tutoring to his daughters at their home. Initially, the protagonist is hesitant to accept the job, but his sister reminds him of their financial difficulties, so he decides to take it. He also asks his sister for the last name of the man paying for the tutoring, and she tells him it's Nakano. When the protagonist realizes that the redhead girl he just rejected is named Itsuki Nakano, he quickly concludes that she, along with her sisters, will be his private students. For this reason, the protagonist decides to greet her, but she's still upset about being rejected earlier at lunch. So later, he tries to make amends with her, but she deliberately chooses a seat where he can't join her, forcing him to sit alone at another table. He knows he needs to patch things up with the redhead girl that same day since it will be their first day of private tutoring at night, and if things remain as they are, it will be very uncomfortable. However, he notices another girl sitting in front of him who turns out to be the redhead's sister, Yatsuba. At this point, he doesn't know they are sisters yet. Yatsuba strikes up a conversation with him about their exams and openly admits that she got a score of 0 on hers, indicating that she's not very good at exams from the start. Since the protagonist isn't great at socializing, he initially ignores her, but when he realizes that she's not leaving, he hands over his exam paper to her to ease her worries. Later, when classes end, the protagonist tries to catch up with Itsuki to apologize for his behavior earlier. After some effort, he manages to talk to her in the building where she lives. She initially doesn't want to speak with him and tells him she's waiting for her private tutor. That's when the protagonist confesses that he is her private tutor. Obviously, Itsuki is not thrilled about it, but in the end, she has to accept it. That's also when the protagonist learns that Itsuki has 4 sisters who he will also be tutoring. But that's not all. Despite the girls looking different, it turns out that all 5 of them are quintuplets. Later, the protagonist enters the room where he is supposed to give his private lessons, but none of the girls show up. He asks one of the sisters what happened to the others, and she leads him to each of their rooms to inform them that it's time for the lessons. However, none of them agree to have someone their own age who also attends the same school as their tutor. These girls are clearly trying to sabotage his job. Later, the 5 girls sit down to eat, and the protagonist intends to start the lessons. However, the girls don't pay him any attention. They offer him cookies and give him a drink, which turns out to have a sedative. After drinking it, the protagonist falls asleep and wakes up when he's already being taken home by Itsuki, who asks him to forget about being their tutor. The protagonist was telling her that he couldn't quit the job when his little sister appears. Upon learning that Itsuki is one of the students he will be tutoring, she invites her to dinner. Since the protagonist's little sister is quite charming, Itsuki can't refuse. During dinner, Itsuki realizes that the protagonist's family is quite poor. After the meal, she tells him that she understands why he needs the job. She may not fully agree to have him as their tutor, but she's willing to allow him to continue coming to their house for lessons. The protagonist is relieved that he won't lose his job. Now he just has to convince the other 4 girls. The truth is that none of them want to be taught by the protagonist, so he decided to give them an exam with the condition that those who pass will be free from him as their teacher. To pass the exam, they just need to score 50 points, and well, the waifus were motivated to take the exam because they know that by scoring 50, they can get rid of the protagonist. But alas, the highest score achieved was 32, so no luck there. It's clear that all 5 of them need help, but the problem is that none of the 5 want to admit it. Later, when it was time to go to school, the waifus were still distancing themselves from the protagonist because, of course, they hate studying and also dislike the protagonist. So the formula results in them avoiding him. That's why the protagonist is now devising a plan to gain their trust. Since he knows that achieving it with all of them at the same time is difficult, he decided to approach them separately. That's how he started with Miku, but then 2 of the sisters arrived to interrupt, so the protagonist couldn't make any progress. Although, to be fair, saying that isn't entirely accurate because a while later, the protagonist noticed that Mika left him a letter asking to meet him on the rooftop. So Futaro went to the rooftop thinking that she was going to confess to him. But no, what she did was provide him with an answer to a question he had asked about 5 hours earlier, so the response was a bit late, but well, everyone has their own timing. There, the waifu also confessed to the protagonist that she admires some generals from the Sengoku era, saying that's why she feels weird. And the truth is, she is weird, but since the protagonist is trying to gain her trust, he tells her she's not weird. They also start talking about the Sengoku-era generals, which helps the protagonist bond with Miku. Taking advantage of her passion for the topic, Futaro proposes that they study Japanese history together so he can continue talking to her about the generals she admires. Of course, with this, the protagonist manages to make her interested in studying, but on the way, he offers her a drink, and given the past incidents, he worries it might be another sedative. However, Mika notices that the protagonist doesn't know much about the Sengoku era since he didn't understand a reference from that time with the drink, so now she is hesitant to be taught by him. As a result, she later starts avoiding the lessons and the protagonist has to chase her around the school until they both get tired. The protagonist goes to get a drink, returns with the answer to the previous reference, and with this, Mika begins to trust the protagonist again. However, she still doesn't believe that the protagonist can help her or her sisters improve their grades. But then the protagonist reveals the results of the answers each of them gave on the exam he gave them. He points out that all of them answered different questions correctly, adding up to a total of 100 points. Since they are quintuplets, he believes they have the capacity to learn what the others know, and if he can achieve that, his job as a private tutor will be done. The catch is that his biggest challenge will be getting all 5 waifus to be willing to be guided, as there are times when 2 of them want to, but the other 3 do not, and so on. There even came a moment when he gathered 4 of them, but the 5th one refused to be taught by the protagonist. Not only that, but she started sabotaging by telling her sisters to go elsewhere, and with this, the protagonist was left without students. Well, the only one left was Miku, but since she's alone, she says there's no point in giving classes like that. Still, the protagonist was convincing her to review Japanese history. But then, the scheming sister called Nino arrives, challenging Miku to a cooking duel, and well, Mika ended up accepting. Now, instead of giving classes, the protagonist finds himself acting as a judge to determine which of the 2 cooked better. But of course, as the protagonist has a poor palate, he says both meals are equally delicious, so there's no winner in this competition, which greatly upsets Nino. Later, the protagonist goes to wash the dishes and realizes that Nino hates him. But Mika says he just needs to earn her trust. So now, the protagonist is thinking of a way to gain Nino's trust because she's the one who has given him the most trouble. Let's not forget that she was the one who drugged him with the drink, and in her most recent move, she made her sisters leave the class. After a while, the protagonist enters the Nakano mansion and notices that Miku is in her underwear drying her hair, which makes him feel uncomfortable. But he's going to feel even more uncomfortable when he sees that Miku is wearing Nino's hairpins because the waifu was never Miku, it has always been Nino. Without the hairpins, she looks like Miku, and that's normal, after all, they are quintuplets. The only positive thing for the protagonist is that Nino hasn't realized he's there because she doesn't have her contact lenses, and without her contact lenses, she doesn't see well, so she thinks the protagonist is Miku. At one point, she tells the protagonist, thinking he's Miku, that she wants Futaro to leave the house. But then, some books are about to fall on her head, so the protagonist goes to prevent it. Hearing a male voice, Nino realizes that it wasn't Miku but a guy who saved her. Furthermore, Itsuki arrives to take a picture of the scene, so they accuse the protagonist of trying to take advantage of Nino, knowing that she is partially blind without her contact lenses. Well, at least Mika defends the protagonist, saying it was all an accident. After an intense debate, the protagonist apologizes for the accident and the trial ends. However, Nino is not pleased with this and throws a tantrum sitting outside the building. When the protagonist was leaving for his house, he saw her there, sat down beside her, and tried to earn her trust. But Nino said she would still hate him and went back inside the building with Miku, sticking her tongue out at the protagonist as she left. The next day, the protagonist is at home with his sister since he has a day off. Suddenly, Itsuki knocks on the door as she came to deliver the money sent by their father for the lessons. Taking advantage of the fact that the protagonist finally has enough money, he mentions that he can finally pay his debts and decides to take his little sister to the arcade. But not only does he take her, Itsuki also joins them since the protagonist's sister asked her to accompany them. Itsuki can't refuse the protagonist's sister, so the three of them spend the day together at the arcade. After finishing with the games, the three of them leave the arcade and run into the other four sisters. Upon seeing the protagonist's sister, they invite her to continue spending time at the amusement park. So, even though the protagonist had planned to go home, he had to wait while the quintuplets took his sister to all the attractions. At one point, they come back with a bag full of fish, a gift from Yotsuba, and when the protagonist's sister thanks her, Yotsuba is also charmed by the girl's charm, so they continue to explore the festival together. At some point, they get lost in the crowd and Nino ends up surrounded by people getting jostled. When she's about to fall, the protagonist saves her. Later, they go to watch the fireworks, and now it seems that Nino doesn't hate the protagonist as much. They may not get along very well, but at least they can stay in the same place for more than 5 minutes without fighting. At this point, the protagonist agrees to go and find the rest of the waifus. When he's about to grab a chica to bring her to Nino, a mustached man appears out of nowhere to stop him and ask who he is. The stranger is the one who seems odd, and while the protagonist is trying to decide whether to say he's a friend, a teacher, or an acquaintance, the man and a chica leave the area. While the protagonist is searching for her, he comes across Miku, who has hurt her foot. He carries Miku and they both start looking for a chica as the situation with the mustached man seems quite strange. After a while, the protagonist decides to treat Mika's injured foot as she can't move very quickly with him carrying her. After this, he asks Miku if she knows the mustached man, and she says that she saw a chica once with a mustached man but doesn't know the details. Later on, the protagonist spots Itsuki and goes to find her with the intention of gathering all the sisters to take them back home. However, in a moment of carelessness, Ichika suddenly appears and takes the protagonist to an alley where she asks him not to tell anyone about the mustached man, which is very suspicious. At that moment, Ichika directly asks the protagonist why he cares so much about her and her sisters, considering he's just a teacher. Well, the protagonist didn't know how to answer that because he knows he shouldn't be so concerned about girls his own age. But after this, Ichika was about to leave the alley when she noticed that the mustached man was outside looking for her. So she turned back and hugged the protagonist, hiding her face from the mustached man. It seems like the waifu is hiding from the mustached man, but no, it turns out that the mustached man is a film producer who works with Ichika, and the hug between Ichika and the protagonist is to give him some good shots for his movies. However, the mustached man didn't realize that it was Ichika hugging the protagonist, so he ended up taking Miku, thinking she was Ichika. Well, even though they are quintuplets and all, this producer is a bit of a dimwit because he should be able to tell by the hair, but you know how anime goes. So the protagonist and Ichika had to rescue Miku, and it wasn't until the mustached man saw both of them that he realized Miku wasn't Ichika. So he took the real Ichika since they have a very important audition. But since the protagonist noticed that Ichika didn't seem very eager to go to that audition, he followed her to ask if she really wanted to go. Instead of answering, Ichika plays dumb and asks the protagonist to help her practice her role. So we see Futaro starring in a romantic scene with Ichika, and after finishing, the protagonist confesses to her that he accepted to be her private tutor because his family has a huge debt, and even though he hasn't given them a single lesson, they still paid him. He feels indebted to them, so he's taking care of them now. He asks Ichika to tell him the truth about whether she wants to go in her agent's car for the audition because he noticed she was trembling earlier, and he also notices that her smile is fake. Ichika is surprised that the protagonist noticed her fake smile but clarifies that her nervous attitude is because she doesn't want her sisters to find out about the audition. She promised them that she would become an actress but wants them to find out after she has already gotten a role. So Ichika goes with the mustached man and presents her audition just before they close since she arrived late due to her escape. Afterward, she finds the protagonist outside, sleeping with his eyes open on a bench. The reason he was waiting for her was to take her to where her sisters were. Knowing that Ichika missed the fireworks, they decided to light one for her to watch together. In the meantime, the protagonist's little sister is lying on a bench as if she were homeless. It's one thing for the quintuplets to want to enjoy the fireworks together, but was it necessary to expose the protagonist's sister like that, making her sleep on a bench like a homeless person? I don't know, Rick. The next day, we find out that Ichika got the role and she was able to tell her sisters. So she's feeling more relieved now. But what's important is that at school, they announced that the midterm exams are approaching. This leads the protagonist to be super intense, asking the waifus if they feel prepared. However, Itsuki didn't like the protagonist's intensity, especially because her friends are starting to think that the protagonist is her boyfriend. So she gave him a slap to calm him down. Nevertheless, the protagonist went to the library to make sure that Miku, Ichika, and Yotsuba are studying. After accompanying them in their learning process, he was about to go home when Itsuki appeared, running to catch up with him because she has a call for him. The call is from the waifu's father, who thanks the protagonist for taking care of them in his absence. However, this old man doesn't beat around the bush. He warns the protagonist that if any of his daughters fail the midterm exams, he will fire him from his job as a private tutor. So now, the protagonist will have to work twice as hard to earn the waifu's acceptance. In a moment of stress, he scolds Itsuki and even tells her that he would never teach someone like her for free. This makes Itsuki even more upset, and now the protagonist is worried that he will lose his job. He even started playing Monopoly with the 3 waifus who accept him, but eventually regained his composure and told them it's time to study regardless of the situation with the other sisters. However, Nino, as always, comes in to divert their attention from studying, and later, Itsuki shows up and says she will study alone since she doesn't want to accept the protagonist's help but also doesn't plan to fail. Afterward, Nino wanted to kick the protagonist out of the house, but Ichika asked her not to do it since the protagonist would give them lessons. Before the lessons, the protagonist went into the mansion's bathtub to relieve his stress, and that's when Nino entered and told him that she heard that her father would fire him if any of them failed. So it's clear that she plans to purposely fail to get rid of him. However, Futaro still has a work ethic, so he stayed to teach the 3 who want to learn. At one point, Mika asked him a rather strange question: what type of waifus does the protagonist like? This question has no academic background, but since the waifus wanted to know the answer, the protagonist said that his ideal girl should have 3 qualities but that he would reveal 1 for each completed page of homework. This way, he managed to get the waifus to focus on their tasks, and for each waifu who finished, he revealed 1 quality. In the end, he revealed 3 qualities of his ideal girl, disappointing the waifus a bit because they thought the protagonist would refer to romantic preferences. However, the protagonist says he's not currently focused on finding a girlfriend. The next day, we see the waifus having breakfast, and at some point, the girls decide to style Itsuki like Miku, all with the intention of confusing the protagonist to see if they can trick him. He's in one of the rooms sleeping with Miku, which is pretty sketchy, folks. The fact that the protagonist and Mika slept together is not right, but anyway, the protagonist seemed unaware that Mika had stayed to sleep with him, so he tried to sneak away without being seen. The problem is that the other Miku, who is actually Itsuki, was waiting for him outside. The protagonist recognized her because he spotted her pajamas in time, and also because he slept with the real Miku. Let's not be fooled here. But anyway, the protagonist quickly closed the door because he didn't want Itsuki to see that Miku was inside. Later, when they asked him if he had seen Miku, he cynically claimed that she might be in the library, even though he knew he had locked her in his room. However, they went to look for her in the library where, obviously, they didn't find her. At some point, an idea came to the protagonist's mind to improve his relationship with Itsuki, so he rushed to the building where he found Mika coming out. She blushed and asked him about how they slept last night, but he assured her that they did nothing wrong, which relieved her. After this, the protagonist went directly to Itsuki, treating her as if she were Miku since they were dressed the same. The protagonist used the confusion as an excuse to talk to her, help her with her tasks, and also apologized for his past offenses. The waifu accepted his apologies and offered her own for her past behavior, and apparently the war between Itsuki and the protagonist ended. Now he just needs to make peace with Nino. The problem is that it's already late, they overslept due to staying up late, and they are running late for school. They notice that the school gate is already closed and it happens to be the day of their midterm exams. However, the protagonist doesn't want all their preparation to go to waste, so he comes up with a plan where one of the waifus wears a green ribbon on her head, a demonstration that they have permission from a teacher to arrive late. The gatekeeper allows this waifu to enter, and since the 5 of them are quintuplets, the other 4 manage to pass through with ribbons, making the gatekeeper believe they are the same waifu. Now, when the protagonist tried to do the same, he failed because the gatekeeper realized he wasn't the same waifu from the ribbon. So, he was taken to the principal's office for being late and deceitful. This is how, after the protagonist's glorious sacrifice, the waifus came together to work hard on their exams so that Futaro's efforts would not be in vain. However, after a while, we find out that the waifus failed almost all of their subjects, only passing 1 each. In the rest of the subjects, they all failed, which means the protagonist will no longer be their tutor. The guy then offers each of them a farewell piece of advice. Later, Itsuki receives a call from her father, who wants to talk to the protagonist to find out how his daughters are doing. Naturally, the protagonist was going to tell him the truth that the waifus failed and he should find a better tutor for them. However, Nino snatches the phone from the protagonist and tells her father that each of them passed 1 subject, not mentioning that they failed all the others. With this, she managed to prevent her father from firing the protagonist. However, after ending the call, Nino says that it won't be easy to keep her father deceived, so the protagonist will have to ensure that they pass all their subjects in the next midterm exams, or he will indeed be in trouble. So, the protagonist is now at home, deep in thought about the fact that despite all the studying they did, the waifus failed almost all their subjects. His father, who got him the job as their tutor, tells him not to study at home, which is quite contradictory. I've never heard of a father telling his son not to study, but well, this guy is a bit odd and we have to accept him as he is. Later, the protagonist goes to the waifu's house, where instead of making them study hard, considering they all failed, he starts eating cookies. This guy is way too accommodating. If I failed a subject, my mom wouldn't even give me food. Anyway, while he's busy gobbling up like 10,000 cookies, he gets indigestion and ends up lying on the floor in stomach pain. Itsuki, Yotsuba, and Nino try to take care of him to help him recover. By accident, the careless Yotsuba spills hot food on the protagonist's cheek, making him scream and get up. That's when the redheads realize that he's not as sick as he claims to be, so they go off to do other things. The only one who stays to take care of him is Yotsuba, and taking advantage of the moment they are alone, she confesses to the protagonist, telling him that she likes him. But no, folks, this waifu is a real troll because she immediately says it was a joke. And well, that's not nice. But that's not the end of it, because the next day, the protagonist waits for Yotsuba to come and scares her with a creepy mask. Personally, I don't think it's very scary, but it scared Yotsuba, so I guess it counts. Then, the school librarian arrives to ask the protagonist and Yotsuba to stop making noise, so they have no choice but to start studying. But the studying session doesn't last long, as Ichika arrives talking about a new app and everyone gets hooked on it, including the protagonist, who should set an example of maturity as a teacher, especially since his job is on the line. But no, this guy is becoming more irresponsible every day. At one point, while Yotsuba is showing him the progress of her app, the protagonist notices that she received a call from the basketball club. Being the nosy person he is, he follows her to see what Yotsuba does in that club. He concludes that her enrollment in the club is an excuse not to study. And indeed, that was her initial reason, but she also mentions that she'll take some time off to focus on studying, so now she's doing the right thing. Sometime later, the protagonist goes to the waifu's house, where they are supposed to be studying. But can you believe it? The protagonist is being lazy too. He starts piercing Nino's ear, although his real intention is to retrieve a little notebook that the waifu had stolen from him. He succeeds in getting it back, but when the waifu falls, she catches a glimpse of a portrait of a blonde guy about whom the protagonist didn't want to give many details. The next day, we see something we've never seen before. Out of the blue, Ichika asks Miku to impersonate her. We see Ichika handing Miku a wig while Miku goes to the bathroom to put it on. Now, Miku will pretend to be Ichika. What Ichika didn't mention is that she wanted to avoid a persistent guy who keeps asking her to be his girlfriend. This guy was waiting for Ichika to invite her to the dance. So now Miku, pretending to be Ichika, has to deal with him. The guy starts to realize, based on Ichika's behavior, that the girl in front of him isn't Ichika but one of her sisters. That's when the nosy protagonist intervenes to save Miku, calling her Ichika even though he knows she is Miku. However, the intense guy didn't like the protagonist interfering in their conversation and he was about to get angry. But then, the waifu grabs Futaro's arm and says he will be her dance partner, pretending they are dating. Since the guy is quite intense, she had to hold the protagonist's hand to make him believe they are really dating. This successfully gets them out of the situation with the intense guy. After this, the protagonist goes home to take care of his little sister, who turns out to be sick. Seeing her sleeping on the floor makes me feel a bit sorry for her. No wonder she fell asleep on a bench without any problems last time. The following day, the protagonist was supposed to go on a 3-day camping trip with the waifus. However, he decides to cancel because he'd rather stay home and take care of his sister. His father is surprised to see him at home because he was supposed to go on the camping trip. The protagonist claims he prefers to stay home and study during the 3 days of the trip. However, his father insists that he should go because it's a unique opportunity in life. At this point, the protagonist mentions that the bus has already left. But then his sister gets up, saying she no longer feels sick, and Itsuki appears to take the protagonist outside. The waifus didn't leave without him. Instead, they decided to wait for Futaro and travel by car. So, the 6 of them head to the campsite. However, they get stuck in a traffic jam due to snow, forcing them to camp in a cabin. The problem is that the cabin doesn't have enough rooms, so one of the waifus will have to share a room with the protagonist. They start debating about what to do to avoid any inappropriate situations with the protagonist, but it's more likely that he'll start teaching them math before anything else. We even see him pulling out some playing cards and later calmly eating. However, Nino, who is the most distrustful of them all, debates during a bathroom break about who will sleep next to the protagonist. Since none of them wants to do it, they decide that all of them will. I know it doesn't make much sense, but that's what they say they will do. That's why we see all 5 waifus entering the room where the protagonist is already asleep. The next day, we see all of them sleeping in the same bed with the protagonist in the middle. When Ichika wakes up, she can't resist touching the protagonist a little. That's when Itsuki enters and is surprised by the scene. There, the waifu ends up encountering some teachers who are in charge of the camp, and they are also staying in the same place due to the snow. So now, the waifus and the protagonist can finally get on the bus and join the group trip as planned. So, sometime later, everyone had arrived at the campsite, including their other classmates. Soon, it was time for a forest walk, during which the protagonist and Yotsuba decided to scare some classmates with their respective spooky costumes. At one point, they tried to scare Ichika and Miku, but those two already knew that the protagonist and Yotsuba were playing around in the forest. On the other hand, we see Itsuki with Nino. Itsuki is quite jumpy, so when she saw the masked protagonist emerge from a tree, she ran away in fright. Nino had to go after her and saw a blonde guy coming out of the forest, whom she identified as the same boy she had seen in the photo in the protagonist's notebook. But hold on, folks, that boy in the notebook was the protagonist, and the blonde boy in the scene is also him. He just hasn't removed the wig from his mask. Now, Nino is treating him kindly because she finds him handsome. Since the protagonist realizes that Nino hasn't figured it out yet, he decides not to say anything and points her in the direction to go back. However, Nino asks him to accompany her because she's lost, but the truth is Nino is hopelessly in love with the protagonist in his blonde form. As the protagonist tries to get rid of her, he starts mentioning things he likes that he knows Nino doesn't, but Nino claims to like those things too because, well, she simply likes the boy in his blonde form. At one point, the boy runs away and Nino follows suit, but she doesn't realize that there's a precipice ahead. She almost falls off, but the protagonist saves her. However, he's the one who's about to fall off now, but Nino saves him and they end up in a compromising position. After this, the boy gives Nino an amulet to protect her from harm. Nino takes the opportunity to invite him to the dance, which is the same dance the protagonist already agreed to go to with Ichika. Later, Itsuki arrives in tears because she's still scared, and Nino's distraction with Itsuki allowed the protagonist to leave. Sometime later, he managed to remove the wig and went to the camp's house, where he noticed that Nino was very happy because she thought the blonde boy would dance with her. But he knows he can't dance with two waifus at the same dance, so he considers telling Nino the truth. However, he couldn't find her, and he was then tasked with carrying logs with Ichika. He took the opportunity to ask Ichika for some advice, and she, being the most rational of the five, offered her help. The protagonist decided to cancel with Ichika for the dance so that he could disguise himself as a blonde and dance with Nino. However, before they could discuss it further, they had to hide because some waifus started talking outside, and those mischievous girls ended up locking them inside. In this situation, the protagonist suggests breaking down the door, but Ichika asks him not to try it because it would activate the alarm and ruin the camp. Instead, she asks the protagonist to be her stepping stool to reach the alarm, but that doesn't work either because the alarm is too high and they need a key to deactivate it. So, their only option is to make a fire, which, to be honest, is a silly idea, but sometimes the protagonist behaves that way. During this time, Ichika tells the protagonist that she's thinking about taking a break from school because she's getting a lot of acting jobs. To this, the protagonist expresses concern because if she leaves school, that means her pay would be reduced by 20%. In other words, Ichika shared her thoughts about leaving school expecting the protagonist to be concerned for her, but no, Futaro is a bit dense. He preferred to focus on starting a fire. Then, Ichika tells the protagonist that she'll accept not dancing at the bonfire event, but she wants them to dance at that moment. The protagonist agrees, but before they can start their forbidden dance moves, a log falls and activates the alarm along with the sprinkler system. They have to leave the area before they get caught. However, Itsuki and Mika open the door right then, which leads the waifus to come up with strange ideas about the two of them. The teachers also scold them for locking themselves in and triggering alarms. Because Ichika got wet that day, she ended up getting sick. Itsuki stayed to take care of her, so they weren't present for the skiing activity. Well, not at first, because later, the irresponsible Ichika showed up, all covered up and coughing as she didn't want to miss out on skiing. While skiing with the protagonist, she asked if he had told anyone about what she mentioned the previous night about thinking of leaving school. The protagonist says he didn't, but then he couldn't stop and crashed into a tree, dropping several things he was carrying, including a band-aid that Nino had given to the blonde version of him. Ichika assumed it was the blonde boy, and since the protagonist didn't want to reveal himself, he didn't show his face and ran off to hide in a place where, as it turns out, Mika was also hiding. Mika has a crush on the protagonist, so being stuck together made her fall for him even more. After the protagonist left, Mika decided to call Ichika to discuss what to do about the protagonist, as both of them are starting to have feelings for the great Futaro. But as they are sisters, Mika suggests that since the protagonist has two hands, he can hold one for each of them. Just as she's saying this, the protagonist appears again, so Mika stops talking about it and they all go to meet the rest of the waifus. They all gather, but Itsuki is missing, so they need to look for her to see where she went. The protagonist suggests taking the cable cars because it would give them a better view to find her. However, he soon realizes that Ichika is actually Itsuki. When they were skiing, he called her by her last name, and Ichika stayed behind in the cabin taking care of her illness. As Itsuki sees that the protagonist recognized her and pays attention to her, she starts to develop feelings for him. However, the protagonist faints, so they have to take him back to the cabin as he's also sick. The school director says that the protagonist will have to rest and will miss the dance. This disappoints the waifus, and the protagonist takes the opportunity to call Nino and tell her that he met the blonde boy while skiing and he sent his apologies but had an emergency, so he couldn't attend the dance with her. Nino is left without a dance partner, just like Ichika and Miku. The two sisters console each other with a hug, and Miku confesses to her sister that she likes the protagonist. On the other hand, we see that the protagonist is suffering from a high fever while the director takes care of him. But then, the director is called away for something, and Itsuki takes the opportunity to sneak into the room, turn on the light, and check on the protagonist. However, she's not the only one, as all 5 waifus had the same idea. They're all worried about him, even though Nino denies it. So, all 5 of them stand there, watching over the protagonist as he lies half dead in bed. Much later, we find out that the protagonist is getting married. Yes, that's right, he's getting married. We see his sister bringing him the wedding ring since he had left it at home. Now, the big question is, who is he getting married to? We see one of the quintuplets entering the room, but since she has a different hairstyle, we don't know which one it is. It could be any of the 5. During the camp trip, there was a legend that those who held hands during the bonfire event would become a couple for life. When that event happened, we see all 5 waifus holding the protagonist's hand, 1 finger each. However, we only see one of them getting married. This either means that the 5 of them fused into one or that it's all a dream. I believe it's the latter because shortly after, we see the protagonist again with all 5 waifus saying that he will make them study. So, what they wanted to imply is that in a second season, the protagonist will form his harem with all of them. By the way, if you want me to summarize a second part, leave the word quintuplets in the comments and I'll get to work on it.